Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this next session entitled Strengthening the Finance Partnership. My name is Colin Laird, and I look after APAC for Brightflag, based here in Sydney. And I'm delighted to be here with Stephen Donaldson, who's Head of Legal Operations at Optus today. Welcome.
Thank you, Colin. Hi, everyone. So I thought I'd just introduce myself a little bit. As some of you may know, I've got a couple of Optus, ex-Optus colleagues in there, Peter and our former General Counsel, which is great. So how did I get into legal operations? It's a little bit similar to what you've heard from some of the other speakers from Tabcorp and ANZ and Telstra. My background's primarily program management, business and IT. Last 4 years I've been at Optus and I've been running what was called the corporate portfolio. So that meant anything that had risk, legal, compliance, regulatory, a little bit of security or HR finance, it defaulted into my portfolio. So I had a team of program managers and business analysts, and at that point there was a large scale budget attached to some of that stuff. So we did have an opportunity when it came to the legal projects in particular, because I remember I started the journey when Jenny Reese was the General Counsel and she had no budget. So she goes, oh wow, we get this for free. So I started doing some PM/business architecture / consultancy for legal. And now that we started off with a knowledge management journey, which turned quickly into the flavour of the month, which was Clock Legal Operations. And out of that, we went on a journey of starting to put some legal tech in. So that's my background, and I've been at this for 18 months at the moment. So I suppose I can sit here and say we've implemented Brightflag. We've also implemented matter management, net documentations, documentation repository, some other marketing tools, and we've got some contract lifecycle management stuff in place as well. So I suppose we're getting beyond foundation level and we're moving into the next level of maturity.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the discussion that we've been having, I guess what's been really clear is the relationship with finance. And it's something that is certainly a theme coming up through the sessions and through organisations that we're talking to. The relationship with finance is really important, stating the obvious. And that certainly with the conversations we have, there's often friction there in terms of different systems, different people want different things. Often things like reporting can take time to assemble. So really, I guess the purpose in this session and the discussion today was to understand, how that is at Optus, and maybe start by talking about the structure of the legal function at Optus and how that looks like.
Yeah, sure. Optus, we've got in-house counsel, roughly 50 legal staff in the team, predominantly lawyers. There's only about 2 or 3 admin out of that whole pool, so it's quite large. We've got a general counsel. We have 5 deputy general counsels. The DGCs are spread across an organisation structure which covers Optus business, infrastructure, which is basically IT and networks, the largest portfolio in the whole group. We've got compliance. We also have consumer, which we have a lot of our marketing and sales legal advice goes through there, a lot of tactical go-to-market plus strategic program work and litigation. So that's the key in-house counsel function. In tandem to that or parallel, I call it like a federated model. So in-house counsel is kind of like the hub and the spoke of this in the enterprise organisation. Is we have other groups in Optus at the enterprise level, such as property networks and property retail, Optus Insurance and AB Finance actually, and Mercantiles. They all engage with external law firm panel supply partners for legal advice as well. So it's kind of enterprise-wide in terms of the scope and scale of the legal function. Traditionally, the visibility from the general counsel, the in-house team, was focused on that particular cost centre or the business advice engagement through there. But increasingly, of course, this group reports to the Chief Financial Officer locally in Australia, and they also report up to the Chief Operating Officer in Singapore at the global level. So increasingly, there's a need to, where is all the legal spend happening in this company? So that kind of segued itself into, an acknowledgement that we probably had a lack of visibility across the organisation structure of who was engaging with legal services outside and where was the budget and the finance and the money sloshing around the company.
It's a nice image, money sloshing.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit more about then, I guess, the responsibilities to finance, because as a matter management e-billing platform, we don't exist in isolation. One of the things we do in organizations is help the organization come together in terms of data and systems and process over time. What was that like at Optus in terms of working with finance? What were some of the activities that people had to do to try and reconcile and give people a picture?
Yeah, I think the finance function at Optus is quite fragmented, and it's really been that way for quite a while, certainly since I've been in this role for the last 18 months. I had some awareness of this before. I was in legal as a program manager, trying to get funding and go to approval, draw down gates, all that sort of stuff. But I suppose in terms of the granularity of the legal and finance relationship, I think it's obviously individual based. So there might be individuals like we've got a legal practice coordinator who deals with that finance team quite regularly. She tries to maintain good relationships and positive interaction with those people. But there's constant churn. Optus is always restructuring, so that includes finance. Optus really has a model now where they've offshored a large chunk of the back end processing for accounts payable. So that's being managed through offshore Accenture team. So that really means that a lot of the subject matter expertise that was in place at, say, Macquarie Park campus where I'm residing, you really lack that go-to, who do I go to and have this discussion? So it's all got to be online, on collaboration tools. It has to be via the intranet portal, lots of Skype activity on Microsoft. Really, it's very difficult to pick up the telephone and just ring anybody offshore to find out who I need to speak to in finance. So obviously there's a couple of figureheads inside Optus that are still there that you could establish those relationships and go to from a stakeholder engagement perspective, but they're very busy and overstretched. So I suppose really there's a lot of frustration in stakeholder engagement, communications. Who do we go to? The lawyers themselves in in-house counsel don't have a natural affinity to want to be involved in the finances. They're now increasingly having to deal with the demands of self-serving or running their own little mini practices themselves in the way they're engaging with the external law firms. So with that, it's quite challenging. What's the original budget? Where is it? How can I find the work in progress? When were the payments being made? And so it just heightens this tension that is kind of bubbling around at the moment.
Yeah,
so,
and just on that, was that tension both ways? So was there any experience of how finance was perceiving legal in that picture?
Probably I can't really comment that there was anything that obvious, except really when we want to get information or put in a request to get extracts of data or something. It's quite frustrating to get that source data information out of a SAP system through a CR process. So we probably, from a legal perspective, probably demanding to get information at fingertips in real time to get to a senior leadership team reporting for them, and probably the frustration of then have to escalate. And suppose obviously the team at the other end is frustrated because we're not following a rigorous engagement process or a model where there is defined SLAs about how to source this information quickly.
Yeah, and so who's assembling all of this? Sounds like there's a lot of assembly going on.
There's a huge amount of assembly going on. So if I just explain a little bit about that. So really on what we did at Optus before Brightflag was there was a process in place that the legal practice coordinator derived an Optus template. So this Optus template was an Excel spreadsheet, and it was given out to, say, the 8 or 10 panel supply firms that we had. So the ask of them was to input manually all the data for all the matters, all the metadata descriptions of what that is, the budget, the PO, the stakeholders, the internal, external lawyers, that kind of information, which business unit, what subgroup, what categories we're talking about, whether it's procurement, compliance, IT, litigation. And that information then was with the law firms, and then they would have to come back in an Excel spreadsheet back into the in-house counsel through the practice coordinator. That would probably take each of those law firms about 5 days, 4 to 5 days, or 1 week per month to compile that manual data. It would come back into our practice coordinator. Then she would actually have to extract information and probably manipulate that into another view that could take her 2 to 3 days, especially in a bad period, which was usually end of month processing. So the law firms did submit some of the invoices through, on an ad hoc miscellaneous basis, but a lot of them batched up towards the end of the month because they're heading towards the payment cut-off dates. So she would have to manually do that herself. So in a sense, that was probably well executed in some way because it was her responsibility to do that with general counsel and the deputy general counsels, and she owned it. But when you went outside of the in-house counsel to those other groups I mentioned, like property, especially networks or retail, they weren't necessarily doing that, following that process. They had their own processes. They may even had their own system. So they were managing that life cycle of the matter, the execution of the work, the advice, the closure, the approvals, and the payment, and back to accounts for actually cash transfer to bank. It was just inconsistent across, say, 5, 6 different siloed pieces of the organisation. So very heavy, and then that obviously had a end goal, which was, I believe, the GC is reporting that to the ELT about the current state of play.
Yeah.
So there's a potential discrepancy in data accuracy all the time.
And what you've described is surprisingly common. I won't ask, a naming and shaming session with the audience to put their hand up, but it's a very common scenario. And so the next obvious question is, what did you do about that? So it sounds like there's recognition that the improvement could be made. It could be more automated or simpler or whatever. Where did you start with that process?
Well, I suppose we knew there was a problem, but to be honest, it was a bit like was mentioned in one of the other transformation sessions. I think we had a couple of general counsels at the time, and I sort of rocked up with my legal tech ops role and said, here's all these shiny toys that we're working on. And the last general counsel at the time of Brightflag said, that sounds great. Forget all that. I want the e-billing management system. Let's go forward with that one. So we sort of had some direction from the General Counsel, which was great. So we had sponsor stakeholder buy-in because we had some budget availability at the time. So that helps no end. Then I suppose we started looking at, well, where do we start with this? Because obviously you can't just launch a new application into an environment like Optus without going through a whole raft of governance approvals and roadmap authorizations with IT. So I think where we started with that was we sort of had initial pre-sales sort of discussions with Brightflag, but also in parallel to that, I started having conversations with our head of corporate shared services IT around SAP Ariba, because that's our strategic financial management platform. And if you don't get IT on board, you won't get any application in, especially a cloud-hosted one. So I sort of synced up with IT, my role, getting the corporate shared services group on board, that this was a sort of contained, legal-centric solution to an ongoing problem that demanded that we have more real-time capability to view high-profile, complex law firm advice engagements with external parties, and that SAP Ariba it basically wasn't going to give us that because that was a code-based GL system with generate lines of information and budget data which have to be analysed by somebody in legal. Plus, if you want to get that information, you have to put a service request in. There's a turnaround time. It's not real time. So we knew those were the fundamentals. Then basically what I had to do then was we sort of looked at it from a technology, people process technology perspective. From a technology, really did a comparative analysis of the features and functions of SAP versus the features and functions of Brightflag from a legal perspective. Tied into that, going into areas about usability, the GUI, ease of navigation, release management, the ability to get updates through a particular cloud application like Brightflag versus having to go through a long development lead time life cycle to change something with the finance process, of which the whole entire enterprise was tied into. And then, of course, support. So if you're going to do that, so that was really the technology part of it. From a what was our requirements perspective, we went back to the MSAs, and we went, Peter, who's here today, is DGC. He did a lot of work on those MSAs, and we looked at those to see what have we actually signed up to here in terms of SLAs with the law firms. So out of that came a whole analysis with a couple of the lawyers in the team, and we defined our billing guidelines. And admittedly, we got some outside help from Brightflag and maybe even Telstra. But
and did you just a question on finance then? Was there any engagement with finance at that point in the process when you were building the case, or was it more we're going to build this case from what we know and with those stakeholders?
Yeah, not really from a business finance representative's perspective. Of course, the SAP application itself is owned and managed from Singapore. So the corporate shared services functions slightly different to some of the other application areas of inside Optus. Usually in, say, consumer or your typical CRM or billing kind of applications or data warehouse, it's locally Australian Optus sort of owned and governed, whereas these shared services platforms like SharePoint, SAP, this kind of thing is Singapore management. So we tend to kind of avoid it to the tail end and play the game, I suppose, to a degree to get through the IT tick off and the security part. And then once you know you've got that in your pocket, it becomes a little bit more compelling that you can influence the change across the organisation.
Yeah, and so I guess the tip we got given today is mostly true, which is engage finance and go and get to know them, unless they're in Singapore and might get in the way of your process.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So how is it today, Stephen, in terms of, let's talk about the good first. What's working well regarding these sort of refreshed processes? And
so I think what's working well is the obvious. We've started the journey. We do have all of our law firm panel supply vendors uploading invoices into Brightflag. We're starting to get some statistics out, which is showing which areas of the in-house counsel in particular where we're spending our money for external advice. So that's really good. It's starting to give the General Counsel and the DGCs the tools that they need to sort of start managing their pieces of the organisation in a little bit more structured manner, and probably moving a bit more to a decentralised model internally in legal in the in-house counsel, in that it was all being funneled through the General Counsel primarily and the practice coordinator. So now we're really trying to get the DGCs or some nominated special senior counsels to take ownership within those competency team areas and start working on what the views are in terms of where's the money being spent. Is it on the high value stuff? Is it on complex stuff? Which of it is got a long tail end in terms of engagement? So I suppose they're the obvious things. The flags are actually working reasonably well for us. They're popping up lots of suggestions. I think in the last 6 or 7 months, we've had suggested savings in the order of over $100,000. Have we realised those? I think the answer would be probably not, because probably we've still got a way to go with the relationships with the partners and the actual process of the lawyers actually wanting to pick up the phone and have those challenging conversations. There's a handful who are up for it and are starting to do it, but there's a lot that are coming, kicking and screaming, I suppose, to the table to do
encouraged that. And training.
That's right. So one of the things we've talked about, we haven't actually done it, but we've talked about is embedding KPIs into the senior council's development plans to try to reduce some of the spend on advising out that they're doing and seeing if there can be savings there, but don't think that made it into this round. So that's going well. I think the other part is that outside of the in-house counsel, we do now have visibility of those other groups I mentioned. And it's been very interesting to see what's actually happening in those areas. So proportionately, 50 to 50% of the spend inside Optus is not in the in-house counsel jurisdiction. It's outside of that area. So we're now starting to get the tools to see what those other groups are really engaging the external law firms in. So, for example, there's a lot of repeat work that's happening in network property, which is related to lease renewals of base stations and mobile towers across the country. So it's quite repeat, high churn, kind of high volume, low complexity kind of work. So think the tool has actually helped some of the conversations that have happened in that area. There's been a fairly GC engaged movement with DGCs to move away from what you'd call, say, a tier 1 law firm into like a tier 2. So trying to drive those costs down in some of those areas. So that is happening. So I think that's going reasonably well. The other part about it that's good is that internally, I think it's a lot clearer internally on a per matter basis. Brightflag is actually providing that granular workflow view of actually who's the first approver, who's the second approver. So I don't think that was clear in many cases, somewhat subjective on the second approver especially. At least now that's actually sort of happening. So I suppose from a finance perspective, it's getting there in terms of, we've got the matter, we've got the PO, we've got the budget, we've got an invoice being uploaded by the law firms. We're getting down to that approval stage.
Yeah, fair enough. And so in terms of, I guess, then challenges that still remain and what's coming next, what does that look like?
Well, the obvious one is SAP. So for us, this is a conversation we're having with Brightflag, and we're working on the solution. We really need to integrate Brightflag to SAP, because at the end of the day, it's not providing us a full end-to-end life cycle view of a law firm engagement and the actual billing and invoice payment process around it. So we've got that in terms of our key thing, which for us we believe is going to get us what we call a phase 2 outcome. Yes, we probably could have defined the requirements up front during phase 1, the initial engagement, but I don't think, to be honest with you, we would ever got there, because Optus is one of those environments where if you just keep going with a long feasibility definition phase, you'll probably never get there. And then you're also at the mercy of management above you, outside of you, actually cutting the funding or moving the funding because you haven't actually delivered anything. So for us, a goal was, yes, we did do what, I think maybe someone's called it a legal tech slam. We did a legal tech slam with Brightflag to a degree, but once we've got it in, actually now we're trying to get this phase 2. I've written a BRS myself for phase 2 because that's how important it is to us to actually get internal engagement and get this right. So we have a scenario where we've got double handling in the sense that we're in Brightflag, then we call them purchase order people. So there's POPs all around Optus, and they might have a different process. So these POPs have got to go into Brightflag. They've got to look at them, do the approvals, they've got to do that sort of stuff. I'll just bore you a little bit with the process. So they cut and paste the purchase order number, they cut and paste the invoice number, they take the PDF, they put into a draft email. They then turn around, they go into a SAP system. They go into SAP system, log on, do all this sort of stuff. Then they generate what's called a GRN, Goods Receipts Notice. Optus has a 3-way match criteria for payment of any invoice. The PO, the invoice, and the GRN. If you don't have the GRN, it'll be rejected. So they do that. They then take the GRN, they put it back into the draft email. They tidy it all up. They write, I approve all this, and they hit send, and it goes to a Dropbox called AP Accounts General. At that point, they go, phew, I got that done. Then we're at the mercy of Optus's procurement terms and payment processes, which is usually end of month, day 1 plus 30 days. Optus is renowned for not paying its bills. And law firms are always ringing up saying, where's my payment? Where is it at? So all the practice coordinator in our particular team can say is, well, I sent the email to the accounts payable Dropbox. So then if I come back to what I said before about everything being offshored and outsourced, where do you go? You've just got an email and you've just got a PDF attachment, and you've got a very angry partner / lawyer in a law firm ringing up, Peter and whoever and saying, where's my payment? Peter goes, well, I don't know, it's not my job, and so then it just starts this whole process. So those 2 local people I mentioned before, what our practice coordinator does is she has her own repository. She double handles, triple handles, and saves everything. So she expects that most payments will have an escalation. So then she can just go bang to the head of procurement locally and say this needs to be paid. And then generally after that gets through, the payment might happen. But that might mean that the law firm or the customer is not getting paid for 90 days and our terms are 30 days.
So I need to ask the obvious question, which is what happens when Brightflag's integrated with SAP? What would that look like?
hopefully it'll look a lot better than that. So it should actually, so just the other quick point I'll say is that the toggling between the systems, we can manage it inside the in-house council, but those other groups, splinter groups I talked about in our federated model, they're at the point where some of them are saying, I'm not going to use this anymore if you don't fix this. So we kind of have to do it. So we're getting user adoption issues and I'm downing tools, this is too hard. That little email thing that I've told you about, our coordinator can do that in 5 seconds, but other people are saying it takes half an hour or it takes 15 minutes. So, you can't win these battles. So what would it do for us?
Yeah.
Get rid of that noise to start with. But also the main thing it's going to do for us is it'll provide us with the ability to say, here's traceability, transparency of the invoice payment cycle.
End to end.
End to end. So you're in Brightflag, you've created the matter, you've done the backwards and forwards with the law firm, you've done the approvals. Then when you hit enter, it's triggering into that SAP cycle. There will still need to be, we believe in our case, the need to do that quick GRN and put the GRN back into Brightflag, but everybody internally at Optus is totally on board with doing that because the benefit still is, even though that still will be a double handle, we can't get around this because it's just the nature of our SAP system. The tail end, and once it goes into that process, would mean that we have a date stamp. We authoritatively can point to a time that said it went out on that day to SAP via our automated file interface. We could get back a reverse notification feed, we call it, and that can show us WIP, work in progress status of that payment, and it can also show us back into Brightflag payment flag that it's actually been put to the customer's account. Mm-hmm. So we'll be able to say to the law firms, it was sent to accounts payable on this date, and then we know it's accounts payable. We then can say it's work in progress. And by the way, you can see that yourself in Brightflag law firm. Go and have a look. Drive adoption by the law firms back into Brightflag, because that is one thing we're finding, that we're kind of pushing them all the time to get self-serve in Brightflag themselves. Then the tail end of it, you should be able to see a completion status flag inside Brightflag. Mm. So a lot of these phone calls, emails, escalations, sure, there'll still be exceptions, but the automated matching nature that we believe internally, talking to our SAP architecture team, it'll be a lot better than what's currently in place today, which is all sort of manual reconciliation.
Yeah, and as I said at the beginning, not uncommon. Spreadsheets, emails, phone calls, and yeah, a whole lot of friction.
Yeah.
So yeah, great. Well, obviously delighted that you're on the journey, and we might at that point just open it up to any questions if there's anything anyone would like to ask.
So I might just like to add that we've got a scenario at Optus where we've got some funding which is available to us now. We've got a financial calendar that ends in March. So these guys all know it. We're under a fair amount of pressure to get a joint solution together. So the solution's looking like it'll be, there's 3 options really. One is you automate the email out to accounts payable. The second one is you send a batch file transfer. The third one is APIs. We're wanting to go for APIs for real time, but that's kind of like the plan. So Brightflag have, to their credit, working proactively back with us, and they've given us a lot of interface specifications. We've got open dialogue with the Dublin team and the local team, working that out. I've got a SAP architect involved. We're actually designed what we need to do our end. I've got the resources lined up and we're just ready to go. So we actually are about to start drawing down the money next week, and we will be starting to develop this reverse feed to start with back into Brightflag. So it's actually happening.
I feel like saying you heard it here first. Just going to hold back on that one. Well, yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Just acknowledging, obviously, the challenges that you mentioned around looking at the kind of full implementation of Brightflag with some of the limitations you had at your end. Considering some of those, what would you do differently if you went back 12 months or 18 months or however long it was ago?
I think probably 2 things. One would have been definitely the change management stuff, which has been spoken about by a lot of people. We did sort of throw it down the throats of the rest of the organisation to a degree. But like I said, I don't believe if we took the softly approach. My experience inside that company, it usually doesn't work. So probably could have modified that a little bit more for them on the journey. And the other thing was, I think, the workflows. So obviously, Brightflag comes to the table with a set of predefined kind of standardized workflows, but for us, we were quite a rabble internally in terms of what are our processes and workflows. We knew what they were verbally, and I suppose we were kind of expecting Brightflag to come and solve our problem, but in reality they couldn't. They didn't know what was going on internally. And then likewise, we probably didn't have the maturity or the right approach internally to actually go about defining what they all were. So retrospectively, get the processes and the workflow correct up front, not now in phase 2 when it's all documented and got a ribbon around it, and probably tighten up the change management.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for your war stories. It's always it's great when people share. I think it's excellent. I have a question around who owns the problem, and by that I mean a lot of what you have talked about today with Colin is kind of the legal team and your interface with the finance processes, and potentially, let's say, the finance department has similar chaotic workflows with other areas of Optus as well. So it's not just purely legal. And some of the solutions you're coming up with are actually helping the finance team. And I mean, I think I have the same experience at Origin, not just with finance, but equally procurement. So sometimes when you're sort of trying to solve things for your legal team, it can really stray into, you know, helping other business units get their houses in order. So I just wonder if you have a perspective on that and how you've navigated that, obviously through a lot of complexity at Optus, and what you think about that.
You're making me think about the strategic procure-to-pay program, which finance is actually heading up, which is looming large. And yeah, and that project's about giving what's called indirect vendors, which are law firms, the ability to log onto a portal and upload their invoices. So I suppose what I'm talking about probably doesn't solve that problem, but in a bizarre way, what we're doing enables a predefined set of requirements for that strategic program. So I'm quite motivated to get this nailed. So then when that program comes along, which is supposed to be forming workshops, they're getting to the point where they're doing F&D workshops in, say, February, March. I'm hoping we're in and done, and then just go, here you go. This will help you solve your legal processes and workflow definition in terms of the whether there has to be any customised integrated touch points within direct procurement system, which is SAP Ariba. So I want to get in, so we're in up front before that actually happens. So that's one I think which is on the horizon, which I'm hoping to get ahead of the game. I think if anything, what this does is actually improve some of the processes for those other groups outside of in-house counsel. So if we can get to this point, some of those other teams had quite inefficient processes. So there was still some manual photocopying, scanning and faxing and signatures and GRNs being written onto invoices and things like that. And when we have a conversation with them about, well, that's ridiculous. You just do this in Brightflag, cut and paste in an email. Oh, can I even send that to an email Dropbox? So there are we have laid some foundation work through what we've done to enable those other areas, non-legal areas, to actually do that. But purely from a finance procurement, what have we done there to help? I think if anything, it would be to help stop the email escalations and just having it flow through seamlessly in the back end, because having to email the head of procurement every month with a handful of, escalations from law firms, and some of the money we're talking about is quite large. So hopefully that'll help.
Great. Thank you very much for attending this session. Niamh, do you want to?
So I think it's unheard of that we're finished ahead of schedule, but so we'll have 15 minutes until the next session, so you have until 3:10 if you want to grab coffee or anything.
Thank
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.